Swanson. This is a special segment of the Past American Century. I'm speaking with a special guest today. I'm speaking with Larry Hancock, who has written multiple books about intelligence topics, Kennedy assassination, covert warfare, and this is his most recent book, Creating Chaos. And I'm happy to have you on the show today, Larry.
Oh, it's great to be back.
And this is a very timely book because it's about a special type of warfare that has hit the headlines over the past 2 or 3 years more than ever in my lifetime, although your book shows that it's been a part of warfare since probably the beginning of mankind, but really in the United States from the 1940s to today, and we've been real practitioners of it across the world.
Yes, the practices I talk about in the book, and it's kind of funny because I was trying to go, well, how do you set the context for political warfare, and where do you start? And the point is that the practices I write about are very basic. They don't change. Machiavelli wrote about them in The Prince. Okay, this has been going on for a very long time, and escalated, especially during the day of the empires, the British Empire, the Russian Empire, and you find political warfare as a standard gamut in what was called the Great Game in Asia, with Russia trying to push Britain out of India and really competing with them. And so these are practices, and that's where I really had to start the book, because once you really dig into the practices, and that's the important thing, because practices don't change. If you understand the practices, you can identify them. Only the tools change. And what you were talking about, the reason we see more of it now is that with the internet, with social media, with the global internet in particular, the tools are simply so dramatically much more effective than they used to be. I mean, when you compare dropping leaflets or putting up flyers at night on telephone poles for propaganda purposes with what you can do on the internet, you can understand how things could get really bad quickly. And so that's where the book goes. But the thing is, once you know what the practices are, you can recognize them anywhere.
Well, I want to make one point, and that is that the book, a lot of it deals with Russia and Putin, and we just had this Mueller report come out last week, and this whole thing about Trump and Mueller and Russia, it's dominated the headlines ever since the election, and frankly, it's a polarizing topic. There are people that really like Donald Trump, so just by even talking about this, they kind of get upset, will just shut down, not want to hear it. And then on the other side, there are people who have gotten convinced that Trump is almost an agent or something of Putin. And I think it's useful to step back, and which is what your book does, and understand that, as you just said, that this type of political warfare has different elements, and it's something that's happened before, and we should understand that first before trying to figure out what's going on with Trump or what's going on with Putin. And one thing about Putin, too, is with social media and Facebook, I started to notice Putin on there around 2015, about the time of the Syria controversy with Obama. Obama was going to bomb Syria over usage of chemical weapons, and then didn't do it. And then there was a deal made of Assad, and at the time, Putin put an editorial in one of the major newspapers, either the Journal or the New York Times, attacking American foreign policy and our interventions in Libya and Iraq and then in Syria. And I read that and found myself in agreement with what Putin was saying. And around that same time is when when I started seeing Putin everywhere on Facebook. Putin is is like he's smart. He's all these pictures of him with his the chest naked, showing he's strong. He can do karate. He can do all these things, and it was really a propaganda thing. And then I started watching the RT YouTube channel, and there's things I liked on there, guests I liked, because I could think of myself as someone who can be critical of American foreign policy, and here are people who, a lot of them, I was agreeing with what they were saying. But then when the election came with Clinton and Trump, it wasn't so much Trump, but the Syria controversy or issue of Syria was growing in the news. It became a campaign issue. It was said that Clinton would be aggressive in Syria, would do bombing, and she said things disturbing about that to me. Trump said he would be for negotiations. Of course, when he got in office, he ended up doing an airstrike. But regardless, the point is that over a few years, I thought of Putin as someone reasonable, someone who is a critic of U.S. foreign policy in his statements. But then in 2016, I was getting worried that what if the idea that Clinton was going to win happened, and there would be a confrontation with the U.S. and Russia over Syria that could be dangerous or of some sorts. And I consider the possibility that if that could happen, then I asked myself, what if RT and all the Putin things I'm seeing on social media are actually a campaign, a propaganda campaign by the Russians to have me and other Americans prepped to be sympathetic to the Russian side if there was a serious confrontation between the U.S. and Russia. So I didn't think of the meddling or whatever, the propaganda campaign, the political warfare campaign is in 2016 is really about the election, but more of a sustained thing in case there's a real serious crisis between the U.S. and us. They can get their message out and have a segment of the population sympathetic already. And I think that's where we're at now, where a lot of people, frankly, like Putin because they see him as a critic of U.S. foreign policy or reasonable. They like the RT program. But I think we got to all understand that Putin is a representative or a leader, if you want to call him that, of Russia, a nation state, which can be antagonistic to the United States and has its own interests. He's not just a person with an opinion on U.S. foreign policy.
Well, and I think one of the things that was done quite early on when the intelligence community started investigating the elections of 2016, they actually interviewed the former director of RT in the U.S. They interviewed several people who had worked for RT who were quite upfront and honest about the evolution of RT into a propaganda device and how it was the people that they hired, American commentators that they hired and brought on for certain purposes to reach certain segments of the American public and to be in sync with their views. And it's covered at great length, and it's a wonderful exercise in how you do propaganda and how it was funded and the immense amount of money that was put into it over a span of a couple of years. I will say one of the things that, and kind of to follow along with your introduction, in creating chaos, because I was looking at the practices of political warfare, and I start with the practices, and then I go on into American political warfare during the Cold War, primarily, and actually, because people have looked at the book and said, well, why don't you just start at the end? You know, why don't you just, and the answer is, no, you don't start at the end until you understand transitions and how things change and who used what tool for what purpose, and then you can bring it forward. But the book really has relatively little about uh, Trump in it. It has an immense amount about Putin, because basically that's why Putin is in the title. To understand political warfare as Putin plays it, you've got to follow his career. You've got to follow the evolution of how he used political warfare, when he's turned to social media. And one of the things, again, that really doesn't get much commentary today is that there was quite a bit of evolution. Putin, in his first presidency, was very much a charmer. He initiated a charm initiative with Western Europe. He did a lot of personal diplomacy. That sort of unraveled when he left Western Europe with no natural gas for a month or so in midwinter, and that kind of undermined his, being naturally charming. But it was not until his successor and then his second presidency where you saw an entirely new face of Putin. And I spend page after page going into that evolution and how and why he turned to political warfare, because that's not where he started. And the funny thing is, as you know, I quote Putin several times in the book, telling you exactly in his own words when and why he made that turn. And he doesn't get quoted nearly as much as he should. I mean, he gets quoted in print, and I used primarily Russian sources for this sort of thing. And he doesn't get quoted nearly as much in the American media as he should have been. But there's an evolution. He didn't begin with RT. He began by taking control of the media, which had been largely independent following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He managed to take control of that with his oligarchs, and his friends bought out the media and told them what their coverage would be like. And he issued a public statement saying, yes, the Russian government feels responsible for its media, and we will control what is said on Russian media. And that's where he started. After he took control of Russian media, then he began to utilize political warfare against some of the nations around him, former Soviet republics like Ukraine and Georgia, they had been happy not to be directly under control of Moscow, and he really wanted to maintain the kind of economic and political control that the Soviet Union. It's a step-by-step process. He did it internally, then he did it against the former Soviet regimes on his borders. Then he started doing it to France and Britain. And quite frankly, this is all going on from 2012 through 2014. And he didn't really even begin to focus in on the United States until he realized what kind of an opportunity there was politically. So I guess the long-winded answer is the book is about Putin's political warfare, and there are segments where it interacted with the Trump campaign, but it's about Putin in terms of political warfare.
Well, you have one interesting argument in the book, and I'm looking at something I highlighted in it, and that is you make the argument that during the Cold War, the United States was really acting, you don't use this word, but I would say as let's say a conservative force in the world, trying to maintain order and seeing places such as Central America, Vietnam, Cuba, places in Africa in the 50s and early 1960s. The U.S. is trying to resist regimes changing or falling, and would see efforts of that as being a communist plot or linked with Moscow, and we would have to try to resist that by usually backing authoritarian governments or overthrowing democratic forces, such as in Guatemala, right? Or was the most famous example. And you make the argument that in a way, today the roles have reversed, whereas Putin and Russia are seeing or claiming that the U.S. and Europe are subverting their nation and sphere, what they see as their sphere of influence, are engaging the same type of political warfare that we did in the Cold War to maintain order in their area.
And I'm glad you highlighted that because that's really one of the most important concepts in the book and something you don't see unless you look at the really big picture. And yes, during the Cold War, regime change was viewed as threatening by the U.S. because basically it was viewed as the world communist movement, whereas to a large extent it really wasn't. It was about nationalism and anti-imperialism, but we couldn't see it that way. We really thought, it was all the communists. We just, to some extent, because we were still quite attached to Britain and to France, and we made the decision in Vietnam to kind of follow along behind France and not to follow on with change. And so, yeah, we were a very conservative force because we wanted to preserve the legacy that existed before World War II. Now, if you flash forward to 2010, 2012, Russia had gone through a really terrible economic period with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the fall of communism, because it was a communist country trying to suddenly be capitalist. And that's a very painful experience. And the U.S. did. A, if you want to look at it that way, help them with foreign aid to some extent. Or B, if you look at it, you could say, oh, well, we're trying to buy influence with investment. I don't care how you look at it, but the point is at first, nobody cared because they needed investment and they needed money. But as often happens after a period of time, what they began to see was, what Putin began to see and what the leadership in Moscow began to see was the political alliances and the economic alliances. I mean, they were always tightly connected to Ukraine and Georgia, to some of the other Moldavia, the Soviet bloc nations economically. And they had very beneficial trade relationships. There was an economic equivalent of the Warsaw Pact. And just because the investment was coming from the U.S. and the West, those folks, while Russia was in trouble, had started to look towards the West and Western money. And when Putin started to turn around, when oil prices went back and Putin began to really have the funds to restore a viable Russian economy, it's like, wait a minute, we don't like that change. We like the way it was. We're seeing nations around us look towards the West, where some of them may even want to join NATO. We don't like this. We want it to be the way it was. And so that's Putin's view of the world is really the Soviet sphere of interest. And he says that. If you look at his quotes for his successor after his first period as president, his quotes now, they very clearly say they have a sphere of influence that's in their interest and they want the Western nations out of it. And they will do whatever is necessary to push back. And that's what you saw starting about 2012 in Europe. So I'm really glad you pointed out, because in terms of the big picture, yes, they see the change that started occurring in the first decade of this century as just as threatening as we saw regime change during the Cold War. And so what they've adopted is that they didn't do that much political warfare during the Cold War. They didn't have to, because the regime change that was occurring generally was putting regimes in power that were anti-colonial, anti-Western, socialist, or neutral. So all they had to do was kind of walk in and say, we want to help you. Now
Yeah.
it's a different story.
Yeah, I guess in a way, maybe historians can start to look back, and maybe they will more 100 years from now, and see these socialist movements and communistic movements in the third world as simple mechanisms to get out of colonialism. It's
And
possible.
there was an element. There's always an element of racism. I mean, you had to map in a lot of cases colonialism mounted. I mean, who the colonial power was Anglo-Saxon, and created a lot of hostility. So one of the things I cover in the book in the first part is why the West couldn't see that, why the U.S. when it made its studies seemed to ignore that. They just could never face up to the fact that it was anything other than some mysterious communist, underground movement. If you look at their studies, there'll be a 200-page study, and nationalism or race or local cultural issues might be 3 pages, as to why people didn't like us or people didn't like the regimes we were supporting. Just totally blind to it.
Well, one thing about today's moment and the activities of all the focus in the media, a lot of it is on Putin, and I think there's in the U.S. media kind of an idea that, for example, how should I put this? But um, one book I read a really long time ago was Thucydides, about the Greek, Athenian, Peloponnesian War. And one thing that happened in that time, it was a war among all these city-states. And these city-states had different types of governments, democracies, um, uh, dictatorships, aristocracies, and so forth. And one thing that would happen is that's a pro-dictatorship type element in one city-state would find people that supported that in another one, and try to work with those people to overthrow that government. And then the Democrat forces would sort of do the same thing. And so you can have these like little coups going on, and faction switching sides and so forth. And in some of what of today's environment makes me think of that, in the sense that Putin is not like turning people into communists or something like of that sort, but it finds people that they don't necessarily have to be in some conspiracy together to just believe in authoritarian governments. And people like Steve Bannon would be the best example. He doesn't believe in NATO, and espouses similar views of foreign policy or a way of looking at the world that Putin does. Like Bannon thinks China is the biggest threat in the world, and so some sort of alliance with Russia would make sense to him. And then he likes authoritarian governments. You see it actually in Brazil. Uh, the, the guy that became the president of Brazil. So the point I'm trying to make is it seems to be like little political groupings working internationally together, and maybe networks of money working together too.
I'm glad you brought that out because, again, if I had to list one of the 2 or 3 real broad themes in the book, that's absolutely it, because it ties back to, again, one of these fundamental practices. Machiavelli knew that quite well, is fragmentation.
Mm-hmm.
To if you want to the first stage is always to undermine an adversary, and you don't want to attack them. I mean, political warfare is not about combat and attack. You want to win without doing that. So undermining is very important, and fragmentation, first you want to turn them against each other. And there was a phrase that was popular during the Cold War, and that that really that really captures this to some extent if we try to bring it forward, and that's the concept of fellow travelers. Fellow traveler was a phrase thrown around a lot during the Cold War, a lot In terms of Britain, where early on there had been a real strong socialist party, a real and actually a pretty active communist party, but the Labour Party and the socialist movement found a lot of things to admire in Soviet popularism, if you want to call it that, and actually it became a great security risk during the war. A lot of the early espionage the Soviet Union performed was done with philosophical fellow travelers who had some of the basic, they weren't even necessarily communists. They just felt, there needed to be strong powers. If their governments were too strong, they would dominate the world. They needed to have some balance. Let's share things with the Soviets. And that's what we see now really occurring because, Putin has KGB, former KGB specialists. These guys really know how to do this sort of stuff. And if you step back and take a look, it's easy to find people that share the same things that you want. Putin wants the West out of his sphere of influence. He doesn't want NATO there. He doesn't even want Western economic and political influence, much less NATO. What he would really like is he wants the European nations to turn back on themselves. He would love to see the European Union fail because that would fragment it. He would love to see America first. If you want a slogan that's like pure Putin, America first is absolutely ideal because he wants America to turn back in on itself. Forget foreign policy, forget the Middle East, get out of Syria, because that's an area that was traditionally a large focus of Soviet and Russian, not just Soviet, but the Russian Empire, Russian imperial sphere of influence, which is what he is pursuing, not just the Soviet. So America First, any America First campaign follows in the same direction he wants to go. If American foreign policy was totally focused on Latin America and our southern border, and that we just totally forgot that the Middle East and Eastern Europe existed, perfect. Look towards Mexico. Don't look towards Lithuania or Hungary or Poland or Ukraine. You guys get back on your side of the Atlantic and we'll be good. And I don't say that in the pejorative sense, but in terms of strategy, that fulfills what he's looking for. So anything that their propaganda, their social media influence can do to turn us inwards is in line with his strategic goals.
Well, the crazy thing about it is it didn't seem like it was very hard to do.
Oh, well, yeah, okay. I just, when we started looking, it's not like there were not ample opportunities, okay? And if you look at but let's face it, let's look at some of the extreme examples of the social media warfare that was documented more than a year ago, 2 years ago. Think about this. You've got somebody in Russia who is trolling. And you've got a troll site, and they're spending most of their time trying to encourage Texas independence and the splitting of California into northern and southern states. And you got back at the activity logs, and there are more Russian troll sites on Texas independence websites and blogs than there are Texans. And you see what they're trying to do is they're organizing rallies. And you got a rally in Lubbock, Texas, to put secession from the Union, anti-government, anti-federal government, anything that will be against the U.S. federal government is great. And they're encouraging that. And it's somewhat humorous in a way because a couple of Texans turn up and they start asking themselves, like, who organized this? Who's here that organized? Well, nobody's here that organized. It was organized out of Russia. And yeah, it gets even nastier when you find that some of the rallies that they were trying to, the anti-police rallies, that they were trying to organize protesting the black killings by police were actually being organized and promoted in a very violent and trying to get people out in the street fighting the police. And those trolls are coming out of Russia. I'm not making this stuff up. It was tracked down. See, you can see that anything that turns us inward and against each other, as you said, unfortunately, there's ample fodder for it and venues that already existed. They just had to insert themselves and try to amp it up.
Well, besides simply trying to destabilize, an opponent, what are some of the other key methods of political warfare that, like classic methods that were used in the 40s and are still used today?
Well, the classic method and what you'd call like, DEFCON 5, the first level, the stuff that goes on all the time. You don't really, you know what happens. The FBI watches for it. Classic practices it's called shaping and influence. You try to reach out to a foreign government that you're targeting as an adversary, but you've got diplomatic relations, you've got commercial reps, and you try to put your business people there. You try to get access to policymakers. You try to establish back channels so that if somebody is in a position to influence policy, will talk to you and make sure that, it's open and above board. It's like, you're our friend. You just should represent our views when you guys are discussing this. Sanctions are really hurting our relationships. So these are standard things that go on every day, but which we see in the Mueller report and which we see reaching out to the Trump campaign, but not just the Trump campaign, anybody from either party or any major organization, maybe it's anybody who's active politically, who could get agendas in front of the policymakers. That could be the NRA, who's very active politically. Well, I want access to them. I want to tell my story to them, and maybe they'll repeat my story often enough so it'll begin to affect policy. And we see that all over the place, starting in 2014, 2015, 2016. One of the reasons it was so effective and is so effective now that it was not before is that during the Cold War, there are two things. During the Cold War, you simply would not have, if you talked to a Russian, you were immediately suspect because everybody knew they were an adversary. Okay, Soviet Union collapses. They go through this economic trauma. We're doing business with them. We're sending consultants over there. We're friends now. And then they get some money to invest. And it even gets better because we're not just friends and we're not just investing their money. They got a lot of oil money. And in 2014, suddenly you find in New York City lots of people, Russians on the staffs of banks and investment companies. You find them on Twitter. You find them, and they're just, they're just average people. We all like each other. Let's just talk business. And so it's no longer suspect in general terms. Like Rudy Giuliani said this weekend, why wouldn't I ask the Russians for information? Why wouldn't I ask the Russians for help? You know what would have happened if he had said that in 1972? He's in jail tomorrow. But suddenly the whole world has changed, and we're incredibly naive and unsuspicious, and that's really great if you're doing political warfare. But the point is, one of the things we know, and this is a good dialogue. Somebody says, "Well, why in the world is it terrible that the FBI was even looking at the Trump campaign?" Well, the FBI wasn't just looking at the Trump campaign. The FBI's day job is to look at adversary nations who have policy-level contacts with everybody. It doesn't matter. That's their job. To think that that's not their job is insane. And it's the same is true for the NSA and the intelligence community in general. Their job is to monitor adversaries and see who they're trying to contact and influence. So, of course, they were doing their job. But another reason they were doing their job is because around 2010, 2012, and you saw this in the book, we became aware through Russian defectors that they had a new practice that they had put in place. And that practice specifically was to turn, to leverage, to manipulate first consultants that were doing business with Russian oligarchs, and then any businessman. And all the things that they had attempted to do during the Cold War that we were really literally too suspicious for them to work very well, now they were working extremely well because they're our friends and they've got money. And the NSA knows this, and the FBI knows this, so that particularly elevated their concerns because they know the SVU and the current contemporary intelligence agencies in Russia are playing this game, and Russian intelligence officers have told us that. So, again, the intelligence community knows what it's doing, yet somehow now the people that we trusted to protect us before we're suspicious of. So you see how well that RT propaganda was working?
Oh, it works. It worked great. Well, where do you think at this point in time, I mean, that's a $90,000 question, but where's this all going? Is this, these methods of political warfare, it seems like they're more effective now than maybe they've been in my lifetime, at least.
Oh, they are far more effective now because you can pick venues on the internet so well, you can profile them, you can see where the opportunities lie, and you can get to them for nothing. I mean, they trace the Bitcoin path used to set up some of the troll farms, the web pages, and the cost is trivial. I could compare it with, during the Cold War, American practices are the same way. I mean, we tried to sneak propaganda into countries in Eastern Europe. We tried radio broadcast. We tried balloons. Now all I need is two guys on a computer. It's so incredibly easy that it's much more dangerous, and it's global. I can go anywhere. Some of the most recent Russian troll warfare, and it's no real surprise if you think about it, is being waged out of Venezuela. And Venezuelan websites or internet access points. I mean, because you can do that anywhere you want to. It doesn't have to be a Russian address, So you can move it around quite easily. But I think, and we talked about this a little bit before I talk about it. What worries me most about what could happen next is if you remember a couple of years ago after the election, we had all of these congressional hearings on Facebook and Twitter and all the media platforms talking about how exposed they were and how they really are going to, you have to learn to separate your editorial, et cetera, because you're real media companies. You aren't just, you are real media companies. You need to face up to it. There was all this congressional testimony given. Within the last year, we had the entire intelligence community in front of Congress, once again warning that nothing was being done. Nothing significant was being done to deal with social media warfare. And, they all testified that. And actually, they were all criticized by the president for overstepping their bounds. But, of course, that's what they know to be true. What I grow concerned about is I've actually studied the national security directives that have been issued during the Trump administration. And A, there has been no congressional legislation, and B, not a single national security directive or presidential directive issued to ramp up or put any new measures in place against political warfare, in particular on social media. just hasn't happened. Anything that has happened has been voluntary by the media companies and has been shown to not be working at all. And one of the reasons, is that social media in today's times is contemporary. It's everything that happens in the first 24 hours after some event or the first post. They all retweeted. And any measures you take after that first 24 hours, it's like too late. The damage has already been done. And so I don't see any sign that anything is really happening from a security standpoint. There are no any agency that's taking special measures and any individuals that are doing it strictly on their own. There's no national program to deal with social media warfare. And this is where I will raise the bar and say that is because the commander-in-chief has not made that happen. And even with the issuance of the Mueller report, which documents in incredible detail the Russian intervention, you have still not heard our president even acknowledge that it happened.
Yeah, it's it
So,
is an
if you
amazing
ask
time.
where it's going, it's not going anyplace good as far as I can tell.
Well, it's been an amazing time. On one hand, I also fear that people are more susceptible to propaganda and just misinformation than they ever have before. Or at least it seems that way. And I've had several conversations over the past couple of years where someone would tell me something that they believe that they saw on the internet, which is just completely crazy, and they just, for example, where I live, we don't have these Mexican gangs, what is it,
Right.
whatever it is, whatever, but we don't have them where I live, but there is crime, and drugs and so forth, and there were over a dozen murders in the city I live in, and someone I was talking to told me they got an email saying that this is all part of that gang and it's a plot to revolt against white people and all this stuff. And it's just like, how can you believe something like that? I mean, the murders are being committed mostly by young kids, unfortunately, involved in drugs. I mean, is there reason to think these are Mexicans or it's a part of some big plot? But the guy told me he got an email saying this, and it made me wonder, well, who wrote the email? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from Russia, or is it just someone making it up? Who knows? And that's just one example of how many millions of things are floating on the internet that people just believe with no real backing or evidence or whatever. I mean, the Q thing is just one example, but you could just go on and on and on.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons. It is appalling. When I was growing up, through most of my life, people were proud of being not what I would call critical, but there's a whole, I'm from Missouri. I'm not going to believe it until I prove it. Prove it to me. It's kind of like the American culture was based in facts. I just like, show me the facts, show me the data, show me whatever. I'm kind of a cynic, and at times that annoyed me, but there's a certain strength in that. And it seems like we've abandoned all that. And if you tell me something I want to hear, then it must be true. And we've moved on from, well, I'm going to question everything anybody tells me to, no, the only thing I'll question is if it's not what I want to hear, I'll question it. I'm not going to fact check it if it's what I want to hear. If it's not, maybe I'll look into the facts. But that's really the sad point, and that shows you again the opportunity for political warfare when people don't do fact checking, and when they just, I think the most dangerous thing going on right at the moment is retweet and forward.
Mm.
Retweet on Twitter and share on Facebook. If I want to declare a national emergency and just shut those off for 12 months, you know, we know that during 2016, the most powerful thing that the Russians used was Twitter, far more than Facebook. It was,
Oh, really? I didn't know that. So.
yeah, absolutely. The Twitter impact, I think if you look in the book, I've got some numbers on it. It's just because retweeting is so
Mm-hmm.
easy and retweeting is so anonymous. It's much more anonymous than, well, and the third, of course, is that the hashtag, retweets and hashtags are the most dangerous because they are so anonymous. Um, you can kind of control Facebook, but until you control those two things, you're just totally exposed. Um, and the funny thing is, I don't know how early all this started, but I will tell you that during the Obama administration, I kept getting email forwards of stuff that I immediately knew were not true, and I got it from people that were friends, and I would go back to them and I would give them a link or something, and I'd go, you really shouldn't send this to anybody else, and B, you need to send it back to whoever sent it to you and show them the fact. And from the best I could determine is no one ever did that because they liked it too much. They might say, well, thanks, but, they wouldn't take the effort to go back down the chain and provide the information. Um, in any event, that's...
Well, I'm thinking in the old Twilight Zone show, the original, the black and white one. I've seen every episode of it. There's a famous episode, the monsters are on Maple Street.
Oh, yeah.
And it's really an attack on, I would think, McCarthyism and the Red Scare, and when that was made, and now this is kind of our version of that, maybe, the retweet is exactly what you're talking about.
That needs to be rebroadcast. Yes, that is a perfect example, and showed how deadly it could get, how quickly, and that's one of the things. When you had newspapers and leaflets and radio and stuff in between, those were not nearly as effective as what you're talking about, where it was just local word of mouth. And it's like there's a factor in there that can escalate to violence so much more quickly because there's no mediation. Well, the same thing happens with social media because there's no mediation. Nobody stops to think. They feel compelled to pass it on as quickly and widely as possible. And just like you saw in that Twilight Zone, you know what happens before too long. It can go really nasty.
Yeah, and we all have some responsibility in the world that we live in. What do we want to encourage people to be angry all the time, or what? Just in the messages of what we're sharing of people. So I don't. I mean,
you think medical marijuana should be compulsive? Like, okay, everybody, just chill. Here's your prescription. I don't know.
Or compulsive for some people, maybe
A beer,
that need it. Some
beer
people really need it.
does it for me, but okay.
Well, we've been talking for quite some time, so I don't want to take up any more of your time. And thank you for spending this evening doing this interview with me. And hopefully we'll get a lot of people to listen to it, and certainly they should buy your book and read it, and your other books too, because they're fantastic. And this is kind of, I think of it as a companion piece to your one on covert warfare.
It is, absolutely. Yeah. The three I've done so far that I would really consider companions to get the full picture is shadow warfare, surprise attack, and creating chaos. Hopefully anybody that really took the time to read them would be alerted to the point of at least becoming a bit more critical about what they hear.
And I would also, I've read the surprise attack book too, and that is, for me, the single best account of 9/11 that I've read. So I'd highly recommend people read that book.
I enjoyed the conversation.
You too. Have a good night.
Bye.